On a frigid October morning in 1844, in the quiet Prussian village of Recurrence, a child was born who would one day declare that God was dead and that we had killed him. This child would grow up to become the most dangerous philosopher in history, a man whose ideas would shatter the foundations of Western morality, religion, and truth itself. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and his life would be a battleground between genius and madness, between the heights of intellectual brilliance and the depths of psychological torment. But here's what makes Nietzsche's story so extraordinary. This wasn't just a philosopher writing abstract theories in some ivory tower. This was a man who lived his philosophy, who paid the ultimate price for his ideas, and whose thoughts would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come. From the trenches of World War I to the rise of fascism, from the birth of existentialism to the postmodern revolution, Nietzsche's fingerprints are on every major intellectual movement of the modern world. What you're about to discover is the complete story of how a sickly pastor's son became the philosopher who taught us to dance on the grave of absolute truth. How a gentle scholar transformed into the intellectual terrorist who detonated the moral certainties of an entire civilization, and how a man who spent his final years in complete madness somehow managed to see further into the human condition than perhaps any thinker before or since. This isn't just the biography of a philosopher. This is the story of how one man's relentless pursuit of honesty led him to conclusions so radical that they're still reshaping our world today. We'll journey from his childhood in rural Prussia through his meteoric rise as the youngest professor in Europe. Follow him into his years of wandering and writing in the mountains of Switzerland and the Mediterranean coast, and witness his tragic descent into madness on the streets of Turin. But most importantly, we'll discover why Nietzsche matters now more than ever. Why his questions about power, truth, morality, and human nature have become the defining questions of our age. Why understanding Nietzsche is essential to understanding everything from modern psychology to contemporary politics, from art to science, to the way we think about ourselves. So settle in as we explore the mind that gave birth to the Superman, the will to power, and eternal recurrence, the mind that taught us to question everything we thought we knew about good and evil, truth and falsehood, strength and weakness. Welcome to the complete life of Friedrich Nietzsche. The story begins in 1844, but to understand the man Nietzsche would become, we must first understand the world he was born into. Prussia in the 1840s was a kingdom caught between tradition and revolution, between the old certainties of faith and monarchy and the new forces of nationalism, democracy, and scientific materialism that were sweeping across Europe. Friedrich was born on October 15, 1844, in the parsonage of Recurrence, a small village in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, descended from a long line of clergymen and theologians. His mother, Franziska Euler, came from a family of pastors and scholars. The Nietzsche household was steeped in Protestant piety, German culture, and intellectual respectability, but fate would deal the family a devastating blow when Friedrich was just 4 years old. In 1848, his father began showing signs of a mysterious illness. Karl Ludwig suffered from severe headaches, episodes of blindness, and what appeared to be some form of mental deterioration. Within a year, he was dead at the age of 36. The official cause of death was listed as brain softening, a vague 19th century diagnosis that could have meant anything from a brain tumour to what we might now recognise as early onset dementia. The loss of his father would haunt Nietzsche for the rest of his life. Years later, he would write about the profound impact of watching his strong, authoritative father waste away into helplessness and confusion. Some biographers have suggested that witnessing his father's mental decline planted the seeds of Nietzsche's lifelong terror of madness, a fear that would prove tragically prophetic. Adding to the family's grief, Friedrich's younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, died just 2 years later in 1850, leaving 6-year-old Friedrich as the only male in a household of women. He was now surrounded by his mother, Franziska, his younger sister, Elizabeth, his paternal grandmother Erdmutter, and 2 maiden aunts. This feminine environment would profoundly shape his character, making him both deeply sensitive to the perspectives of women and paradoxically suspicious of what he saw as feminine influences on culture and morality. With no male breadwinner, the family's financial situation became precarious. They were forced to leave the comfortable parsonage in Rücken and move to the nearby town of Naumburg, where they lived in much more modest circumstances. Franziska was determined that her son would receive the best education possible, seeing it as the path to restoring the family's fortunes and social standing. Friedrich proved to be an exceptional student from an early age. He was quiet, serious, and intensely focused, earning the nickname the Little Pastor from his classmates because of his earnest demeanour and obvious intelligence. He devoured books with an appetite that worried his mother, who feared he was becoming too withdrawn and scholarly for his own good. At the age of 10, Friedrich entered the preparatory school attached to the cathedral in Naumburg. Here his intellectual gifts became even more apparent. He excelled in languages, showing particular aptitude for Greek and Latin, and began writing his own poetry and short stories. His teachers were impressed by his maturity and his ability to grasp complex ideas that were well beyond his years. But it was during these formative years that the first signs appeared of the questioning spirit that would later make him famous. Even as a child, Friedrich was troubled by certain aspects of Christian doctrine. He couldn't understand how a loving God could condemn people to eternal punishment for finite sins. He was puzzled by the problem of evil, wondering why an all-powerful deity would permit suffering and injustice in the world. These weren't the casual doubts of a rebellious teenager. Friedrich approached religious questions with the same intense seriousness he brought to his studies. He read theology, philosophy, and biblical criticism, trying to find satisfying answers to his questions. His mother and the other women in his household assumed this was a sign of his future calling to the ministry, but Friedrich was already beginning to suspect that the answers he sought might not exist within the confines of traditional Christianity. In 1858, at the age of 14, Friedrich received a scholarship to attend Schulforta, one of Prussia's most prestigious boarding schools. Founded in the 16th century, Schulforta had educated some of Germany's greatest minds, including the poets Novalis and Hölderlin. The school was famous for its rigorous classical curriculum and its emphasis on character development through discipline and scholarship. The transition to boarding school was difficult for Friedrich. He was younger than most of his classmates, physically frail, and already showing signs of the health problems that would plague him throughout his life. He suffered from severe headaches, digestive troubles, and episodes of what he described as nervous exhaustion. Some of his fellow students mocked him for his serious demeanour and his obvious lack of interest in typical adolescent pursuits, but Friedrich found his element in the school's academic programme. The curriculum at Schulforta was built around the intensive study of classical languages and literature. Students were expected to think, speak, and even dream in Latin and Greek. They read Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle in the original languages, not as historical curiosities, but as living voices speaking directly across the centuries. It was here that Friedrich first encountered the ancient Greeks in all their complexity and contradiction. He was struck by the vitality and creativity of Greek culture, but also by its darkness. He read about the tribal warfare, the slavery, the casual cruelty that coexisted with the sublime achievements in art, philosophy, and literature. This would later become a central theme in his mature philosophy, the idea that human greatness and human brutality are inextricably linked. Friedrich also discovered the German Romantic poets during his years at Schulforta. He was particularly drawn to Hölderlin, whose poems celebrated the beauty and power of ancient Greece while lamenting its loss. Hölderlin had also struggled with mental illness, eventually succumbing to madness, and Friedrich felt a deep kinship with the tortured poet's vision of a world where beauty and meaning had been lost. But perhaps the most significant development during his time at Schulforta was Friedrich's growing mastery of philology, the scientific study of language and literature. Philology in the 19th century was far more than just literary criticism. It was a method for understanding entire cultures through careful analysis of their texts, their grammar, their ways of thinking and expressing ideas. Friedrich's philological training taught him to read between the lines, to see how language shapes thought and how thought shapes reality. He learned to trace the evolution of ideas across time and to recognize how the same concepts could mean radically different things in different historical contexts. This would prove crucial to his later philosophical method, his ability to uncover the hidden assumptions and contradictions in Western thought. As Friedrich approached graduation from Schulforta, he faced a crucial decision about his future. Everyone expected him to follow in his father's footsteps and study theology, preparing for a career in the Lutheran ministry. His mother certainly hoped for this, seeing it as a way to honor his father's memory and provide financial security for the family. But Friedrich was increasingly torn. His studies had awakened serious doubts about Christian doctrine, doubts that he couldn't simply set aside. At the same time, he was passionate about classical literature and philology, subjects that offered little prospect of financial reward but promised intellectual fulfillment. The decision he made would set the course for everything that followed. In 1864, at the age of 20, Friedrich enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and philology. He was trying to satisfy both his family's expectations and his own intellectual interests, but this compromise would prove unsustainable. The University of Bonn in the 1860s was a centre of cutting-edge scholarship in both theology and classical studies. The theology faculty included some of the leading figures in biblical criticism, scholars who were applying the same rigorous methods used in classical philology to the study of Christian texts. They were asking hard questions about the historical reliability of the Gospels, the authorship of biblical books, and the development of Christian doctrine over time. For Friedrich, exposure to this scholarship was both exhilarating and devastating. He saw how the methods he loved in classical philology could be applied to Christian texts, revealing the human, all too human origins of what he had been taught to regard as divine revelation. The more he learned about the historical development of Christianity, the more difficult it became to maintain his faith. At the same time, he was studying under some of the greatest classical scholars of the age. He was learning to see ancient Greece and Rome not as distant, idealized civilizations, but as real human societies with their own complexities and contradictions. This historical perspective was teaching him to think of all human values and institutions as products of specific times and places rather than eternal truths. The intellectual atmosphere at Bonn was electric with controversy and discovery. Friedrich found himself caught between two worlds that were rapidly pulling apart. In his theology lectures, professors were dissecting the Bible with the same critical tools used to analyze Homer and Virgil, revealing layers of editing, contradiction, and historical development that made simple faith increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, his philology courses were opening up the rich, complex world of ancient literature where gods were not moral exemplars, but passionate, flawed beings who embodied the full spectrum of human experience. Friedrich's crisis of faith wasn't a sudden dramatic break, but a slow, agonizing process of intellectual honesty. He found himself unable to participate in religious services with the same conviction he had felt as a child. The prayers felt hollow, The hymns seemed to speak of a world he could no longer recognize as real. He was discovering what would become one of his central insights, that knowledge and innocence cannot coexist. His professors noticed his exceptional abilities almost immediately. Friedrich possessed an unusual combination of linguistic talent, historical imagination, and analytical precision that marked him as a potential scholar of the highest caliber. But his fellow students were more puzzled by his intensity. While they attended lectures and completed assignments, Friedrich seemed to be wrestling with questions that went to the very foundations of Western civilization. The turning point came during his second year at Bonn. Friedrich had been struggling with the decision of whether to continue his theological studies or focus entirely on philology. The choice represented more than just an academic specialization. It was a choice between the secure, conventional path his family expected and the uncertain journey of a life devoted to pure scholarship and intellectual honesty. In a letter to his sister Elizabeth that would later become famous, Friedrich announced his decision. He would abandon theology and devote himself entirely to classical philology. But more than that, he tried to explain to her the intellectual and moral crisis that had led to this choice. He wrote about the impossibility of believing something simply because it was comforting or traditional, about the obligation to follow truth wherever it might lead, even if it led to conclusions that were disturbing or socially unacceptable. Elizabeth's reaction was swift and angry. She accused her brother of throwing away his father's legacy and abandoning the Christian faith that had sustained their family through its darkest hours. Their mother was equally distressed, seeing Friedrich's decision as both a practical mistake and a kind of betrayal. The family conflict that began with this decision would continue for the rest of Nietzsche's life, with Elizabeth increasingly positioning herself as the defender of a conventional morality against her brother's dangerous ideas. But Friedrich had crossed a line from which there was no return. Having chosen intellectual honesty over social conformity, he threw himself into his philological studies with an intensity that amazed even his professors. He was learning to read ancient texts not just as literature, but as windows into entirely different ways of thinking and living. In 1865, Friedrich made another crucial decision. He transferred from Bonn to the University of Leipzig, following his favourite professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had been offered a chair there. Nietzsche was one of the leading classical scholars in Germany, famous for his meticulous textual criticism and his ability to reconstruct the historical context of ancient works. Under his guidance, Friedrich began to develop the scholarly methods that would later make him famous. Leipzig proved to be the perfect environment for Friedrich's developing intellect. The university had an excellent library, and he spent countless hours there, reading not just classical texts but also contemporary philosophy, particularly the works of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy, with its emphasis on the fundamental suffering of existence and the need to escape from the endless striving of the will, spoke directly to Friedrich's own sense of alienation and intellectual isolation. But it was also at Leipzig that Friedrich began to develop his own distinctive voice as a thinker. He started writing essays that went beyond traditional philological scholarship, using his knowledge of ancient languages and literature to raise broader questions about human nature, morality, and the meaning of existence. His professors were impressed by the originality of his thinking, even when they disagreed with his conclusions. Friedrich's health, however, was becoming an increasing concern. The intense mental work, combined with his naturally frail constitution, was taking its toll. He suffered from severe headaches that could last for days, digestive problems that made eating a constant struggle, and episodes of what he described as nervous exhaustion that left him unable to work or concentrate. Despite these health problems, Friedrich's scholarly reputation was growing rapidly. In 1868, at the age of just 24, he published his first major scholarly article, an analysis of the sources used by the ancient historian Diogenes Laertius. The article demonstrated such sophisticated scholarship that it immediately established Friedrich as one of the most promising young classicists in Germany. The recognition came at exactly the right time. The University of Basel in Switzerland was looking for a new professor of classical philology, and Ritschl recommended his brilliant student without hesitation. What happened next was unprecedented in the world of German academia. The University of Basel offered Friedrich a full professorship based on Ritschl's recommendation alone, without requiring him to complete his doctoral dissertation or pass the usual examinations. Friedrich was stunned by the offer. At 24, he would become the youngest professor of classical philology in Europe. The position would provide financial security, intellectual prestige, and the opportunity to pursue his scholarly interests without the constraints of family expectations or financial worry. But accepting the position would also mean leaving Germany, becoming a Swiss citizen, and committing himself to a life of academic scholarship. After much deliberation, Friedrich accepted the offer. The University of Leipzig, not wanting to lose such a promising scholar, awarded him his doctoral degree without requiring a dissertation based on the strength of his published work. In 1869, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche became Professor Friedrich Nietzsche, the youngest member of the Basel faculty. The move to Basel marked the beginning of a new chapter in Friedrich's life. For the first time, he was financially independent and intellectually free to pursue his own research interests. The position required him to teach courses in classical literature and language, but it also gave him access to one of the best classical libraries in Europe, and the time to develop his own philosophical ideas. Basel in the 1860s was a small but cosmopolitan city, a centre of Swiss intellectual life, with connections to scholars and artists throughout Europe. Friedrich quickly established himself not just as a teacher, but as a participant in the city's cultural life. He attended concerts, lectures, and social gatherings where he met musicians, artists, and writers who would influence his developing aesthetic philosophy. But perhaps the most significant relationship Friedrich formed during his early years at Basel was his friendship with Richard Wagner, the controversial German composer who was living in nearby Tribschen. Wagner was at the height of his creative powers, working on his monumental Ring cycle and developing his theories about the total work of art that would combine music, drama, poetry, and visual spectacle into a single, overwhelming aesthetic experience. Friedrich was initially overwhelmed by Wagner's personality and artistic vision. Here was an artist who wasn't content to create beautiful objects for the entertainment of the educated classes. Wagner wanted to transform German culture, to create a new mythology that would speak to the deepest needs and aspirations of modern people. His operas dealt with themes of power, love, death, and redemption on a scale that seemed to match the cosmic significance Friedrich found in ancient Greek tragedy. The friendship with Wagner introduced Friedrich to a circle of artists and intellectuals who shared a sense that European culture was in crisis. They believed that the old certainties of Christianity and traditional morality had been undermined by modern science and historical criticism, but that nothing adequate had emerged to replace them. They were searching for new sources of meaning and value that could speak to modern sensibilities while recapturing the power and vitality they found in ancient art and literature. For Friedrich, this search for cultural renewal became increasingly urgent as he settled into his academic career. His lectures on classical literature were well attended and well received, but he found himself frustrated by the narrow focus of traditional philological scholarship. He wanted to use his knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome to address the broader cultural questions of his own time. This frustration led to a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of his career and ultimately his life. Friedrich decided to write a book that would break the boundaries between academic scholarship and cultural criticism, between philology and philosophy. The book would use his expertise in ancient Greek literature to make a radical argument about the nature of art, culture, and human experience. The result was The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, published in 1872 when Friedrich was just 27 years old. The book was unlike anything that had appeared in classical scholarship before. Instead of focusing on textual criticism or historical details, Friedrich used his knowledge of Greek literature to develop a sweeping theory about the psychological and cultural forces that create great art. Art. The Birth of Tragedy was a bombshell that detonated in the staid world of classical scholarship. Friedrich argued that Greek tragedy emerged from the collision of two fundamental forces in human nature, which he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollo represented order, rationality, beautiful illusion, and the principium individuationis, the principle that creates distinct boundaries between self and world. Dionysus represented chaos, intoxication, the dissolution of boundaries, and the terrifying truth of existence. According to Friedrich's revolutionary interpretation, the greatest periods of Greek culture occurred when these two forces were held in creative tension. The Dionysiac festivals, with their wine-fueled ecstasy and ritual dismemberment, provided an outlet for the darker truths of human existence, while Apollonian art transformed this raw experience into beautiful, bearable forms. Greek tragedy was born when these forces merged, creating works that were simultaneously beautiful and terrible, rational and ecstatic. But Friedrich's argument went far beyond ancient Greece. He claimed that modern European culture had become dangerously one-sided, dominated by Apollonian rationality at the expense of Dionysiac vitality. The result was a civilization that was technically sophisticated but spiritually impoverished, capable of great scientific achievements, but incapable of creating art that spoke to the deepest human needs. The solution, Friedrich suggested, lay in the music dramas of Richard Wagner. Wagner's operas represented a rebirth of the tragic spirit, a fusion of all the arts that could restore the lost unity of Apollonian and Dionysiac elements. Through Wagner's music, modern audiences could experience something approaching the transformative power of ancient Greek tragedy. The reaction to The Birth of Tragedy was swift and devastating. Friedrich's colleagues in classical philology were appalled by what they saw as a betrayal of scholarly objectivity. The book contained almost no footnotes, relied on intuition rather than evidence, and made sweeping claims about ancient culture that couldn't be verified through traditional philological methods. Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, a rising star in classical studies, published a savage attack titled Future Philology that ridiculed Friedrich's methods and conclusions. The scholarly establishment's rejection of The Birth of Tragedy was more than just an academic dispute. It represented a fundamental conflict between two different ways of approaching human knowledge. Traditional philology valued precision, objectivity, and careful accumulation of facts. Friedrich was proposing a more intuitive, artistic approach that used a scholarly knowledge as raw material for broader cultural insights. The controversy isolated Friedrich from many of his academic colleagues and marked the beginning of his gradual alienation from university life. His enrollment numbers began to decline as students were warned away from a professor whose scholarly reputation was now in question. The university administration, while not openly censuring him, made it clear that they expected him to return to more conventional scholarly pursuits. But Friedrich was undeterred by the criticism. If anything, the hostile reception of The Birth of Tragedy convinced him that he was onto something important. He began to see himself not just as a classical scholar, but as a cultural physician, someone capable of diagnosing the spiritual illnesses of modern civilization and prescribing remedies. This sense of mission was reinforced by his deepening friendship with Wagner. The composer praised The Birth of Tragedy as a work of genius and encouraged Friedrich to continue developing his cultural criticism. Wagner's wife Cosima, the daughter of the famous pianist Franz Liszt, also became a close friend and intellectual companion. The Wagner household at Triebschen became a second home for Friedrich, a place where he could discuss his ideas with sympathetic listeners and participate in the creation of a new German cultural movement. During this period, Friedrich also formed another crucial friendship that would profoundly influence his intellectual development. Paul Rée was a young philosopher from a wealthy Jewish family who shared Friedrich's interest in psychology and moral philosophy. Unlike the romantic idealists in Wagner's circle, Rée approached human behavior from a naturalistic, almost scientific perspective. He was interested in the biological and social origins of moral feelings, the ways in which evolutionary pressures had shaped human psychology. Rée's influence pushed Friedrich toward a more critical examination of moral values themselves. Instead of simply assuming that traditional virtues like compassion, humility, and self-sacrifice were inherently good, Friedrich began to ask where these values came from and what purposes they served. This line of inquiry would eventually lead him to some of his most radical conclusions about the nature of morality and human motivation. The intellectual ferment of these years was reflected in Friedrich's next major work, The Untimely Meditations, a series of 4 essays published between 1873 and 1876. Now, these essays continued his cultural criticism, but in a more focused and personal way. Each meditation targeted a specific aspect of contemporary German culture that Friedrich found problematic. The first meditation, David Strauss, the confessor and the writer, attacked the popular theologian David Strauss, who had written a book attempting to reconcile scientific materialism with traditional moral values. Friedrich argued that such compromises were intellectually dishonest and culturally dangerous. Either one accepted the full implications of modern science, which undermined traditional religious and moral certainties, or one maintained those certainties by rejecting scientific materialism. The middle ground that Strauss was trying to occupy was, in Friedrich's view, an illusion. The second meditation, on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, critiqued the 19th century's obsession with historical knowledge. Friedrich argued that while some historical awareness was necessary for cultural health, too much historical consciousness could be paralyzing. When people became too aware of the contingency and relativity of all human values and institutions, they lost the ability to act decisively or create new cultural forms. The third meditation, Schopenhauer as Educator, was Friedrich's tribute to the philosopher who had first awakened his interest in fundamental questions about existence and value. But Friedrich's Schopenhauer was less the pessimistic philosopher of resignation than the model of an independent thinker, willing to challenge conventional wisdom regardless of social consequences. The fourth and final meditation, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth, was supposed to be a celebration of Wagner's artistic achievement. But by the time Friedrich finished writing it in 1876, his relationship with Wagner was already beginning to show signs of strain. The essay revealed Friedrich's growing ambivalence about Wagner's nationalism, his anti-Semitism, and his increasing involvement with German cultural politics. The completion of the Untimely Meditations marked the end of the first phase of Friedrich's intellectual development. He had established himself as a cultural critic of considerable power and insight, someone capable of diagnosing the spiritual problems of modern civilization with unprecedented clarity. But he was also becoming increasingly isolated, both professionally and personally. His health was deteriorating rapidly. The severe headaches that had plagued him since childhood were becoming more frequent and intense. He suffered from chronic digestive problems that made it difficult to eat regular meals. His eyesight was failing, forcing him to dictate much of his writing to assistants. Most troubling of all, he was experiencing episodes of what he described as nervous collapse, periods when he was unable to work, think clearly, or engage in normal social interaction. The university was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Friedrich's unconventional scholarship and declining health. His course enrolments had dwindled to almost nothing, and his colleagues were openly skeptical of his methods and conclusions. In 1876, Friedrich requested a leave of absence for health reasons, beginning a pattern of extended absences that would eventually lead to his retirement from academic life. But Friedrich's physical decline was accompanied by an extraordinary intellectual transformation. Free from the constraints of university teaching and scholarly convention, he began to develop the distinctive philosophical voice that would make him one of the most influential thinkers of the modern era. The years of illness and isolation that followed would prove to be the most productive period of his life. The break with Wagner, when it finally came, was both inevitable and traumatic. Friedrich had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Wagner's nationalism and his appeal to German racial superiority. The composer's anti-Semitism, which Friedrich had initially overlooked, became impossible to ignore as Wagner became more vocal in his attacks on Jewish influence in German culture. The final break came in 1878, triggered by Wagner's opera Parsifal. Friedrich saw the work as a betrayal of everything Wagner had once represented, a capitulation to Christian morality and German nationalism that contradicted the revolutionary artistic vision that had first attracted Friedrich to the composer. Where Wagner's earlier operas had celebrated human passion and creativity, Parsifal seemed to preach resignation and religious submission. The end of the Wagner friendship left Friedrich more isolated than ever. He had lost not just a personal relationship, but his connection to what had seemed like a vital cultural movement. The Tribschen Circle, which had provided intellectual stimulation and emotional support during his early years at Basel, was now closed to him. He was forced to confront the possibility that his cultural criticism, however insightful, might be the voice of someone crying in the wilderness, rather than the herald of a cultural renaissance. This period of isolation and re-examination led to a fundamental shift in Friedrich's thinking. Instead of focusing on cultural criticism and the possibility of cultural renewal, he began to turn his attention to more fundamental questions about the nature of human knowledge, morality, and existence itself. The philosopher, who had begun by trying to revive ancient Greek culture, was about to embark on a much more radical project: the revaluation of all values, Übermensch of all values. The transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the mountains above the small Swiss town of Sils-Maria. It was the summer of 1879, and Friedrich had finally taken the medical leave that would effectively end his academic career. At 34, he was a broken man by conventional standards. His health had deteriorated to the point where he could barely function in normal social situations. The headaches came in waves that left him prostrate for days, unable to bear light or sound. His digestion was so compromised that he survived on a carefully restricted diet of crackers, fruit, and weak tea. His eyesight had deteriorated so severely that he could only read for brief periods, and writing had become an exercise in physical endurance. But something extraordinary was happening in the midst of this physical collapse. Freed from the obligations of teaching and the expectations of academic respectability, Friedrich's mind was undergoing a radical transformation. The cultural critic who had spent years diagnosing the problems of German civilization was evolving into something far more dangerous, a philosopher willing to question the very foundations of Western thought itself. The change was evident in his next book, Human All Too Human, published in 1878. Gone was the romantic idealism of the birth of tragedy and the cultural nationalism of the Untimely Meditations. In their place was a new voice, cool, analytical, and devastating in its implications. Friedrich had discovered what he called the historical method, a way of analysing human institutions and values that revealed their contingent, all too human origins. The book was structured as a collection of aphorisms, brief observations that cut through conventional pieties with surgical precision. Friedrich examined religion, morality, art and philosophy not as eternal truths, but as human creations that served specific psychological and social functions. He showed how concepts that people regarded as sacred and unchangeable were actually products of particular historical circumstances, evolutionary pressures, and psychological needs. The implications were staggering. If moral values were not divinely ordained or rationally discoverable, but were instead human inventions that had evolved for survival purposes, then they could be changed, improved, or even discarded entirely. If religious beliefs were not revelations from a transcendent realm, but psychological coping mechanisms, then humanity might eventually outgrow the need for them altogether. If philosophical truths were not eternal verities but cultural artifacts, then the entire Western intellectual tradition might need to be reconsidered from the ground up. Friedrich was particularly ruthless in his analysis of Christian morality. He traced what he called slave morality to its origins in the resentment of the weak against the strong. The Christian virtues of humility, compassion, and self-sacrifice, he argued, were not expressions of divine will, but psychological strategies developed by those who lacked the power to impose their will directly. By making virtues of weakness and suffering, Christianity had inverted natural values and created a culture that celebrated mediocrity and punished excellence. But Friedrich's critique went beyond Christianity to encompass the entire Western philosophical tradition. Plato's world of eternal forms, Kant's categorical imperative, Hegel's absolute spirit, all of these he dismissed as elaborate fantasies designed to provide comfort in the face of a universe that was fundamentally meaningless and chaotic. The philosophers, he argued, were just as guilty as the priests of creating imaginary worlds to escape from the harsh realities of existence. The reception of human, all too human, was predictably hostile. Friedrich's former friends in the Wagner circle felt betrayed by his attacks on romantic idealism and German nationalism. His academic colleagues were horrified by his abandonment of scholarly objectivity and his embrace of what seemed like nihilistic relativism. Even his family was distressed by what they saw as his complete rejection of the Christian values that had sustained them through their darkest hours. But Friedrich was undeterred by the criticism. If anything, the hostile reception convinced him that he was onto something important. He had touched a nerve, exposed truths that people were desperate to avoid confronting. The philosopher, who had once hoped to inspire a cultural renaissance, was now content to serve as what he called a physician to civilization, someone willing to diagnose uncomfortable truths, regardless of their social acceptability. The years that followed were a period of extraordinary intellectual productivity, despite Friedrich's declining health. Unable to maintain a conventional academic or social life, he became a wanderer, moving restlessly between small towns and cities across Switzerland, Italy, and southern France. He was searching for climates that would ease his physical suffering, but he was also embracing a kind of spiritual nomadism that reflected his growing alienation from conventional European society. His typical routine during these years was austere to the point of asceticism. He would rise early, often before dawn, and take long walks in the mountains or along the Mediterranean coast. These walks were not recreational, but essential to his thinking process. He found that his best ideas came to him while walking, and he developed the habit of carrying notebooks to capture insights as they occurred to him. He would return to his simple lodgings to write for a few hours before the headaches became unbearable, then spend the rest of the day resting in darkened rooms. The isolation was both painful and liberating. Friedrich had always been a solitary figure, but now his solitude was complete. He had almost no regular human contact, apart from his correspondence with a small circle of friends and admirers. His sister Elizabeth visited occasionally, but these visits often ended in arguments about his philosophical views and his rejection of conventional morality. His mother wrote regularly, expressing concern about his health and his increasingly radical ideas, but Friedrich found her letters more burdensome than comforting. Yet this isolation was also freeing him from the last constraints of social convention and intellectual respectability. No longer needing to maintain professional relationships or academic standing, Friedrich could follow his thoughts wherever they led, regardless of how shocking or unacceptable his conclusions might be. The result was a series of books that pushed the boundaries of philosophical discourse further than any thinker had dared to go before. Daybreak, published in 1881, continued the psychological analysis begun in Human, All Too Human, but with an even more radical agenda. Friedrich announced that he was undertaking what he called a revaluation of all values, a systematic examination of the psychological origins and social functions of every moral concept that Western civilization took for granted. He was particularly interested in what he called the prejudices of philosophers, the unexamined assumptions that had shaped Western thought for over 2 millennia. The book's subtitle, Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality, announced Friedrich's intention to treat moral values as objects of scientific study rather than eternal truths to be revered. He examined concepts like guilt, responsibility, punishment, and virtue with the same detached curiosity that a biologist might bring to the study of animal behavior. What he found was that most moral concepts were far more complex and problematic than their defenders realized. Take the concept of free will, which was fundamental to Christian morality and Western legal systems. Friedrich argued that free will was a psychological illusion created by the need to assign blame and responsibility. Human behavior was actually determined by a complex interplay of biological drives, social conditioning, and unconscious motivations that made the idea of ultimate moral responsibility meaningless. Yet society needed the fiction of free will to maintain order and justify punishment, so it persisted despite its philosophical incoherence. Or consider the virtue of compassion, which was central to both Christian ethics and contemporary humanitarian movements. Friedrich traced compassion to its origins in the biological tendency of social animals to protect members of their own group. What appeared to be a noble moral sentiment was actually an evolutionary adaptation that had been elaborated and idealized by religious and philosophical traditions. Moreover, Friedrich argued, excessive compassion could actually be harmful, preventing the kind of tough-minded decision-making that was necessary for cultural and individual growth. These analyses were not merely academic exercises. Friedrich was convinced that Western civilization was entering a period of profound crisis as traditional religious and moral certainties crumbled under the pressure of scientific materialism and historical criticism. The old values were losing their power to motivate and guide human behavior, but nothing adequate had emerged to replace them. The result was what Friedrich diagnosed as nihilism, the sense that life had no inherent meaning or purpose. But Friedrich's response to nihilism was not despair, but exhilaration. If traditional values were indeed human creations rather than divine commandments or rational necessities, then humans had the power to create new values that might be more life-affirming and culturally productive. The collapse of old certainties was an opportunity for a kind of spiritual revolution that could liberate human creativity and energy from the constraints of what Friedrich called life-denying moralities. This vision found its most powerful expression in The Gay Science, published in 1882. The title, which Friedrich took from the medieval Provençal poets, announced his intention to approach the most serious philosophical questions with lightness, playfulness, and intellectual courage. The book was a collection of aphorisms and short essays that ranged across topics from art and science to love and friendship, but its underlying theme was the possibility of creating meaning and value in a world without God. It was in The Gay Science that Friedrich made his most famous and controversial pronouncement. In a passage that would echo through the intellectual history of the 20th century, he declared that God was dead and that we had killed him. This was not a statement about theology, but about culture. Friedrich was announcing that the Christian worldview that had provided meaning and moral guidance to Western civilization for over 1,000 years was no longer credible to educated Europeans. The death of God was both a catastrophe and an opportunity. It was catastrophic because it left humanity without the traditional sources of meaning and moral authority that had shaped European culture. But it was also an opportunity because it freed humanity to create new forms of meaning and value that might be more truthful and life-affirming than the life-denying moralities of the Christian tradition. Friedrich's response to the death of God was characteristically bold and optimistic. If humans could no longer look to heaven for guidance and purpose, they would have to create meaning for themselves. This was not a burden but a privilege, the ultimate expression of human creativity and freedom. The challenge was to develop the intellectual and emotional strength to bear this responsibility without collapsing into despair or nostalgia for lost certainties. This theme of self-creation and individual responsibility became central to Friedrich's mature philosophy. He began to envision a new type of human being, someone strong enough to create their own values and live without the support of traditional religious and moral authorities. This figure, which Friedrich would later call the Superman or Overman, represented humanity's next evolutionary step, a movement beyond the psychological and cultural limitations that had constrained human development for millennia. But the path to this transformation was neither easy nor comfortable. Friedrich understood that the transition from traditional morality to self-created values would be painful and dangerous. Most people would not be able to bear the psychological weight of complete freedom and responsibility. They would either cling to the old values despite their loss of credibility, or sink into nihilistic despair when those values finally collapsed entirely. The challenge for exceptional individuals was to serve as pioneers, showing by their example that it was possible to live creatively and affirmatively without traditional supports. They would have to be strong enough to endure isolation, misunderstanding, and persecution while developing new forms of human excellence that could eventually inspire broader cultural transformation. Friedrich saw himself as one of these pioneers, a philosopher whose task was not just to diagnose the problems of modern civilization, but to point toward possible solutions. His books were not academic treatises, but experiments in new forms of thinking and writing that might serve as models for post-Christian cultural creation. He was trying to demonstrate that it was possible to think seriously about fundamental questions without falling into either religious dogmatism or scientific materialism. The literary style of his mature works reflected this experimental approach. Instead of constructing systematic philosophical arguments, Friedrich wrote in aphorisms, poems, and dramatic dialogues that engaged the reader's imagination as well as their intellect. He wanted to show that philosophy could be both rigorous and artistic, both analytical and inspirational. This stylistic innovation was particularly evident in his next major work, which would prove to be both his masterpiece and his most controversial book. As Friedrich entered the middle years of the 1880s, living in increasing isolation but experiencing unprecedented bursts of creative energy, he began work on a book that would attempt to synthesize all of his philosophical insights into a single, coherent vision. The book would be written as the testament of a fictional prophet, allowing Friedrich to express his most radical ideas in a form that was simultaneously philosophical and poetic. The result would be Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a work unlike anything that had appeared in the history of philosophy, a book that would establish Friedrich's reputation as one of the most original and influential thinkers of the modern era, while also marking the beginning of his final descent into madness and obscurity. The conception of Thus Spoke Zarathustra came to Friedrich like a thunderbolt during one of his solitary walks in the mountains above Sils Maria in August 1881. He would later describe the experience as a kind of revelation, a moment when an entire philosophical vision crystallized in his mind with overwhelming clarity. Walking along the shores of Lake Silvaplana, near a massive pyramid-shaped rock, Friedrich was struck by what he would call the most profound thought possible to human consciousness, the idea of eternal recurrence. The concept was staggering in its implications. What if this life, with all its joys and sufferings, its triumphs and failures, its moments of ecstasy and periods of despair, were to repeat itself exactly, infinitely, throughout eternity? What if every decision, every experience, every fleeting sensation were destined to occur again and again, in precisely the same way, for all time? The idea was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, a test that would separate those strong enough to affirm existence unconditionally from those who could only bear life by believing it was temporary and would be compensated by some eternal reward. Friedrich spent the next 2 years developing this insight into the philosophical framework that would become Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book would not be a conventional philosophical treatise, but something entirely new, a work of literature that was simultaneously a rigorous philosophical argument. He chose to present his ideas through the figure of Zarathustra, the ancient Persian prophet who had first taught humanity to distinguish between good and evil. In Friedrich's reimagining, Zarathustra returns to Earth after years of solitary contemplation to announce that the old moral categories are obsolete and that humanity must learn to create new values. The opening of the book established the tone that would make it famous. Zarathustra descends from his mountain cave after 10 years of solitude, carrying wisdom that he must share with humanity. But his first encounter is with a hermit who still believes in God, prompting Zarathustra's shocked realization that this holy man has not yet heard the news. Could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard anything of this, that God is dead. From this dramatic beginning, Friedrich launched into the most sustained and powerful exposition of his mature philosophy. Through Zarathustra's speeches and encounters, he explored themes that would define his intellectual legacy: the death of God, the revaluation of all values, the will to power, eternal recurrence, and the coming of the Superman. But these ideas were presented not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences, emotional realities that demanded personal transformation rather than mere intellectual assent. The writing process was unlike anything Friedrich had experienced before. The words seemed to flow from some source beyond his conscious control, arriving with such force and clarity that he could barely write fast enough to capture them. He would later claim that he was merely taking dictation from some higher power, though he understood that power to be his own unconscious creativity, rather than any external deity. The experience was so intense that he often emerged from writing sessions physically and emotionally drained, as if he had channeled energies that exceeded his normal human capacity. The first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra was completed in just 10 days during February 1883. Friedrich was amazed by both the speed of composition and the quality of what he had produced. He recognized that he had created something unprecedented in philosophical literature, a work that combined intellectual rigor with poetic beauty, profound insight with dramatic power. But he also understood that the book would be difficult for readers to comprehend and accept. Its radical message and unconventional form would challenge every assumption about how philosophical ideas should be presented and what conclusions they should reach. The book's central teaching concerned the Superman, or Übermensch, Friedrich's vision of humanity's evolutionary future. The Superman was not a political ruler or a member of a superior race, but rather an individual who had overcome the psychological and cultural limitations that constrained ordinary human development. This figure would be strong enough to create values without needing external validation, honest enough to face existence without comforting illusions, and creative enough to find meaning and purpose in a universe that offered no inherent guidance. The path to becoming a Superman required what Zarathustra called the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. First, one must become a camel, bearing the weight of traditional values and cultural expectations without complaint. This stage represented the necessary discipline of learning and following established forms before one could transcend them. Then, one must become a lion, developing the strength to reject false values and create space for something new. The lion's function was essentially destructive, clearing away the debris of outworn beliefs and institutions. But destruction was not enough. The final metamorphosis was into a child, representing the innocence and creativity necessary to establish new values. The child could affirm existence unconditionally, finding joy and meaning in the mere fact of being alive, rather than needing external justification or reward. This childlike affirmation was the key to overcoming nihilism and creating a post-Christian form of human excellence. Friedrich understood that this transformation would be achieved by very few people, at least initially. The Superman was not a mass phenomenon but the culmination of individual development, reached only by those with exceptional strength, intelligence, and creative capacity. But these exceptional individuals could serve as models and inspiration for broader cultural evolution, showing that it was possible to live magnificently without the traditional supports of religion and conventional morality. The doctrine of eternal recurrence served as both a test and a teaching method for identifying potential supermen. Those who could embrace the idea that their lives would repeat exactly for all eternity demonstrated the kind of unconditional life affirmation that Friedrich saw as essential for post-Christian existence. The thought was designed to separate those who loved life enough to want it repeated endlessly from those who could only tolerate existence by believing it was temporary and would be compensated by eternal rewards. But eternal recurrence was more than just a psychological test. Friedrich presented it as a possible cosmological truth, a hypothesis about the actual structure of reality that was consistent with contemporary scientific understanding. If the universe contained a finite amount of matter and energy operating according to unchanging laws over infinite time, then eventually every possible configuration of matter would repeat itself. The present moment, with all its details, would occur again and again throughout eternity. Whether or not eternal recurrence was literally true mattered less than its psychological and ethical implications. The idea forced individuals to take complete responsibility for their choices and actions, since every decision would have eternal consequences. It eliminated the possibility of postponing authentic living until some future time, or treating present suffering as merely preparation for future reward. Each moment became infinitely significant because it would be repeated infinitely. The book's literary style was as revolutionary as its philosophical content. Friedrich wrote in a kind of biblical prose that echoed the cadences of religious prophecy while delivering thoroughly irreligious messages. Zarathustra spoke in parables, poems, and dramatic monologues that engaged the reader's emotions and imagination as well as their rational faculties. The effect was to make philosophical ideas feel like lived experiences rather than abstract concepts. This stylistic innovation reflected Friedrich's conviction that traditional philosophical writing had become sterile and disconnected from human reality. Academic philosophy dealt with bloodless abstractions that had little relevance to how people actually lived and made decisions. Friedrich wanted to create a new form of philosophical discourse that would speak to the whole human being, not just the intellect. The second part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra appeared in 1883, followed by the third part in 1884. Each section deepened and complicated the themes introduced in the first part, showing Zarathustra's teaching evolving through encounters with different types of people and various challenges to his philosophy. Friedrich was exploring not just what the Superman might look like, but what kinds of obstacles and temptations would face anyone attempting to live according to post-Christian values. One of the most significant challenges Friedrich identified was the temptation of pity. Traditional Christian morality had elevated compassion for suffering into the highest virtue, but Friedrich argued that excessive pity could actually prevent both individual and cultural development. Someone who could not bear to see others suffer might intervene in ways that prevented them from developing the strength and wisdom that only comes through overcoming difficulties. This did not mean that the Superman would be cruel or indifferent to others' pain. Rather, he would have the discrimination to know when suffering was productive and when it was merely destructive, when intervention was helpful and when it was harmful. The Superman's compassion would be informed by wisdom rather than mere emotional reaction, tough-minded rather than sentimental. Friedrich also explored the psychological difficulties that would face anyone attempting to live without traditional moral and religious supports. The freedom to create one's own values was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Many people would find the burden of complete responsibility too heavy to bear and would seek new forms of external authority to replace the old ones. The challenge was to maintain creative freedom without falling into either arbitrary willfulness or paralyzing uncertainty. The book's reception was initially disappointing. Friedrich had hoped that Thus Spoke Zarathustra would find a wide audience and begin the cultural transformation he envisioned. Instead, the work was largely ignored or misunderstood. Critics dismissed it as the ravings of a madman or attacked it as dangerous nihilism. Even sympathetic readers often missed the subtlety of Friedrich's arguments and reduced his complex philosophy to crude slogans about the will to power or the Superman. The misunderstanding was partly Friedrich's own fault. His literary style, while powerful and memorable, was also ambiguous and open to misinterpretation. Readers could easily extract individual passages from their context and use them to support positions that were contrary to Friedrich's actual intentions. The book's prophetic tone and dramatic imagery made it particularly susceptible to appropriation by political movements that had little understanding of its philosophical sophistication. But Friedrich was not entirely surprised by the hostile reception. He had predicted that his ideas would not be understood by his contemporaries and that true appreciation would come only from future generations. He saw himself as writing for readers who did not yet exist, people who would have been educated by the cultural crisis he was diagnosing and would therefore be ready for the solutions he was proposing. The failure of Thus Spoke Zarathustra to achieve immediate recognition was devastating to Friedrich personally. He had invested enormous emotional and intellectual energy in the book, believing that it represented his most important contribution to human thought. Its rejection left him feeling more isolated than ever, convinced that he was surrounded by people incapable of understanding the magnitude of the cultural crisis facing European civilization. This sense of isolation was compounded by his deteriorating health and increasingly precarious financial situation. The small pension he received from the University of Basel was barely sufficient to cover his modest living expenses, and his books generated almost no income. He was forced to rely on occasional gifts from friends and family members, a dependence that he found humiliating and that increased his sense of alienation from conventional society. Yet Friedrich continued to write with undiminished energy and ambition. If "Thus spoke Zarathustra" had been misunderstood, he would try different approaches to communicate his insights. The period following the completion of Zarathustra saw an explosion of productivity as Friedrich worked to develop and clarify his philosophical position through a series of shorter, more focused works. Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, represented a return to the aphoristic style of his earlier works, but with the philosophical depth and sophistication he had developed through writing Zarathustra. The book was structured as a series of observations and arguments that systematically dismantled traditional moral categories while pointing toward new forms of human excellence. The title announced Friedrich's conviction that humanity needed to move beyond the simple dualistic thinking that characterized traditional morality. Good and evil were not eternal categories discovered through reason or revelation, but human creations that served specific social and psychological functions. Once these functions were understood, it became possible to imagine new forms of moral evaluation that might be more sophisticated and life-affirming than traditional Christian ethics. Friedrich was particularly critical of what he called herd morality, the system of values that emerged when large groups of people sought safety and comfort through conformity to shared standards. Herd morality necessarily emphasized qualities like equality, democracy, and universal compassion, because these values helped maintain social cohesion and prevent conflict. But Friedrich argued that such morality also discouraged individual excellence and cultural creativity by making everyone conform to the standards of the mediocre majority. The alternative was what Friedrich called master morality, a value system based on individual strength, creativity, and self-determination rather than group conformity. Master morality was not about dominating others, but about mastering oneself, developing one's capabilities to their fullest extent, regardless of social expectations or conventional limitations. This distinction between master and slave morality became central to Friedrich's mature philosophy. He traced the development of Western civilization as a struggle between these two moral systems, with Christianity representing the triumph of slave morality over the aristocratic values of ancient Greece and Rome. The result had been 2 millennia of cultural decline, as Europe's most creative and vital elements were suppressed in favour of mediocrity and conformity. But Friedrich was not simply nostalgic for the past. He understood that the old, aristocratic moralities were no longer viable in modern democratic societies. The challenge was to develop new forms of individual excellence that could flourish within contemporary conditions while avoiding the levelling tendencies of mass society. The book also explored Friedrich's growing interest in the psychology of power and domination. He had become convinced that the will to power was the fundamental drive underlying all human behaviour, more basic than even the survival instinct that Darwin had identified as the primary evolutionary force. People did not just want to survive, they wanted to grow, expand, and exercise their capabilities in ways that demonstrated their strength and creativity. This insight had profound implications for understanding human motivation and social organisation. Traditional moralities that emphasized self-sacrifice and submission to external authority were actually contrary to human nature, which explained why they required such elaborate systems of reward and punishment to maintain compliance. A more naturalistic morality would work with rather than against the will to power, channeling it in directions that promoted both individual flourishing and cultural development. Friedrich's analysis of power was subtle and sophisticated, avoiding the crude interpretations that would later be imposed on his work by political movements. He distinguished between healthy expressions of the will to power, which involved self-mastery and creative achievement, and unhealthy expressions, which involved domination of others or destruction for its own sake. The goal was not to eliminate power relationships, but to ensure that they served life-affirming rather than life-denying purposes. The completion of Beyond Good and Evil marked the beginning of Friedrich's final productive period. He was now 42 years old, his health was declining rapidly, and he sensed that his time for major creative work was running out. But he was also experiencing a kind of intellectual clarity and confidence that he had never felt before. The philosophical system that he had been developing for over a decade was finally reaching maturity, and he was ready to present it in its most complete and systematic form. The result would be On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, which Friedrich considered his most important work after Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book was structured as 3 essays that trace the historical development of moral concepts, showing how values that people regarded as eternal and universal were actually products of specific social and psychological conditions. The first essay examined the origins of the concepts good and evil, arguing that they had originally meant something very different from their contemporary usage. In aristocratic societies, good simply meant noble or excellent, while bad meant common or low. These were not moral categories, but aesthetic and social ones, based on the distinction between those who possessed power and refinement and those who did not. The transformation of these aristocratic values into moral categories occurred through what Friedrich called the slave revolt in morality, led by the Jewish priestly class and later adopted by Christianity. Unable to compete with their aristocratic masters in terms of strength, beauty, or cultural achievement, the slaves developed a new value system that made virtues of their weaknesses and transformed their masters' strengths into vices. Thus, humility became superior to pride, compassion superior to strength, and suffering superior to joy. The slave revolt was a brilliant psychological strategy that allowed the weak to claim moral superiority over the strong while avoiding direct confrontation. But Friedrich argued that it had also led to 2 millennia of cultural decline, as Europe's most vital and creative elements were suppressed in favour of mediocrity and resentment. The second essay traced the development of conscience and the sense of guilt, showing how these apparently natural human capacities were actually products of social conditioning and psychological manipulation. The feeling of guilt originated in the material relationship between creditor and debtor, where failure to repay a debt resulted in punishment. This economic relationship was gradually internalized and moralized, creating the psychological mechanism that allowed society to control individual behavior through internal rather than external coercion. Christianity had perfected this system by making every human being a debtor to God for the sin of existing, a debt that could never be fully repaid. The result was a culture of chronic guilt and self-hatred that prevented people from achieving their full potential and enjoying life as it actually was rather than as they thought it should be. The third essay examined the meaning of ascetic ideals, the systems of belief and practice that encouraged people to deny their natural desires in favour of some higher spiritual goal. Friedrich argued that asceticism was not a sign of spiritual elevation, but a symptom of psychological sickness, a way for those who could not bear life to create meaning through the denial of life itself. Yet Friedrich also recognised that ascetic ideals had played a crucial role in human development by preserving and developing intellectual capacities during periods when more direct forms of cultural achievement were impossible. The Christian monasteries had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, and the ascetic discipline of scholars had made possible the scientific revolution that was now undermining the very religious beliefs that had motivated their work. The challenge for the future was to preserve the intellectual and cultural achievements that had emerged from ascetic discipline while abandoning the life-denying beliefs that had originally motivated them. This required developing new forms of self-discipline and cultural dedication that could serve life-affirming rather than life-denying purposes. On the genealogy of morals was Friedrich's most systematic and persuasive work, presenting his critique of Christian morality with unprecedented clarity and force. The book demonstrated his remarkable ability to combine historical scholarship with psychological insight and philosophical analysis, creating a new method for understanding human values and institutions. But even as Friedrich was achieving his greatest intellectual success, his personal situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His health was deteriorating rapidly, with headaches so severe that he sometimes contemplated suicide. His eyesight was failing to the point where he could barely read or write without assistance. His financial situation was precarious, and his isolation from normal social life was nearly complete. Most troubling of all, Friedrich was beginning to show signs of the mental instability that would soon destroy him entirely. His letters from this period reveal grandiose fantasies about his own importance and increasingly bizarre theories about his philosophical mission. He was convinced that his books would soon be recognized as the most important intellectual achievement of the modern era, and that he would be hailed as the prophet of a new age. These delusions of grandeur were accompanied by periods of profound depression and paranoid suspicion of those around him. Friedrich became convinced that his publishers were conspiring to suppress his work, and that academic philosophers were deliberately ignoring his contributions out of jealousy and fear. The isolation that had once been liberating was becoming a prison that cut him off from any realistic assessment of his situation or prospects. Yet even as his grip on reality was loosening, Friedrich continued to produce work of extraordinary quality and insight. His final productive year, 1888, saw the completion of 4 books that would establish his enduring reputation: The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. Each represented a different aspect of his mature philosophy, from cultural criticism to systematic philosophy to autobiography. The Case of Wagner was Friedrich's final settling of accounts with his former friend and mentor. The book was both a personal attack on Wagner's character and a broader critique of the romantic nationalism that the composer represented. Friedrich argued that Wagner's music dramas were symptoms of cultural decadence rather than signs of renewal, appealing to the lowest common denominator of German nationalism and anti-Semitism rather than promoting genuine artistic and cultural development. Twilight of the Idols was subtitled How to Philosophize with a Hammer, indicating Friedrich's intention to test the durability of conventional beliefs by striking them and listening for the hollow sound that would reveal their emptiness. The book was a systematic attack on the entire Western philosophical tradition, from Socrates and Plato through Kant and Hegel, showing how each major thinker had contributed to the life-denying tendencies that Friedrich saw as the fundamental problem of European culture. The Antichrist was Friedrich's most sustained and bitter attack on Christianity, presenting it not just as false but as actively harmful to human development and cultural achievement. He argued that Christian values were literally anti-natural, designed to suppress the very qualities that made life worth living. The book was so inflammatory that it could not be published during Friedrich's lifetime. Finally appearing only after his descent into madness had made him a safe target for censorship. Ecce Homo was Friedrich's intellectual autobiography, a review of his philosophical development and an explanation of his significance for the future of human culture. The book's subtitle, How One Becomes What One Is, announced his conviction that he had achieved a kind of self-creation that could serve as a model for others attempting to live authentically in the post-Christian age. But Ex Homo also revealed the full extent of Friedrich's mental deterioration. The book was filled with grandiose claims about his own importance and increasingly disconnected observations about his philosophical mission. He claimed to be the most important thinker since Christ, the herald of a new age that would transform human civilization, the discoverer of truths that would reshape the entire future of the species. These claims were not entirely delusional. Friedrich had indeed produced philosophical insights of extraordinary depth and originality that would profoundly influence subsequent intellectual developments. But his inability to distinguish between his genuine achievements and his megalomaniacal fantasies was a clear sign that his mental faculties were failing rapidly. The end came suddenly and dramatically in January 1889 on the streets of Turin, Italy, where Friedrich had been living in modest lodgings while working on what he planned as his philosophical masterpiece. Walking through the city centre, he witnessed a coachman beating his horse. The sight triggered something in Friedrich's mind that had been building for years. He threw his arms around the horse's neck, protecting it from further blows, then collapsed sobbing in the street. He was helped back to his lodgings by concerned passers-by, but it quickly became clear that something fundamental had broken in his mind. The man who had spent his life advocating intellectual courage and emotional strength was now reduced to childlike helplessness, unable to care for himself or engage in coherent conversation. The philosopher, who had proclaimed the death of God and the coming of the Superman, had become a living symbol of human fragility and limitation. Friedrich's collapse in Turin marked the beginning of a tragic epilogue that would last 11 years, a period during which the philosopher who had proclaimed human greatness was reduced to a shadow of his former self. His landlord, alarmed by Friedrich's erratic behaviour following the incident with the horse, contacted his friend Franz Overbeck in Basel. The letters Friedrich had been sending in his final weeks of sanity were increasingly incoherent, filled with grandiose proclamations and signed with names like Dionysus or the Crucified. Overbeck rushed to Turin and found Friedrich in a state of complete mental collapse. The man who had once possessed one of the most penetrating intellects in Europe was now speaking in fragments, laughing inappropriately, and showing no recognition of his dire circumstances. Overbeck arranged for Friedrich's immediate return to Basel, where he was briefly hospitalized before being transferred to a psychiatric clinic in Jena. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was progressive paralysis, what we would now recognize as tertiary syphilis, affecting the brain. The disease that had likely been contracted years earlier in his youth was now destroying the neural pathways that had given birth to some of the most revolutionary ideas in Western philosophy. The irony was devastating. The thinker who had spent his life exploring the relationship between mind and body, who had argued for the primacy of physical health in intellectual achievement, was being destroyed by his own flesh. At the clinic in Jena, Friedrich became a medical curiosity. Doctors and visitors came to observe the famous philosopher who now spent his days playing simple melodies on the piano, speaking to himself in multiple languages, or sitting silently for hours staring into space. Occasionally, flashes of his former brilliance would appear. He might recite passages from his own works with perfect accuracy, or make penetrating observations about his visitors. But these moments became increasingly rare as the disease progressed. His sister Elizabeth, who had married a German nationalist named Bernhard Förster and moved to Paraguay to establish a pure Aryan colony, returned to Germany to take control of her brother's care, and more significantly, his literary estate. Elizabeth had always been uncomfortable with Friedrich's radical philosophy, particularly his attacks on German nationalism and anti-Semitism. Now, with her brother unable to defend his work, she began a systematic campaign to reshape his reputation in accordance with her own political beliefs. Elizabeth's manipulation of Friedrich's legacy would prove to be one of the most consequential acts of intellectual fraud in modern history. She edited his unpublished notes selectively, creating works like The Will to Power that presented a distorted version of his philosophy, emphasizing the very nationalist and racist themes he had actually opposed. She cultivated relationships with right-wing intellectuals and politicians, presenting herself as the authoritative interpreter of her brother's thought while suppressing evidence that contradicted her version of his ideas. Meanwhile, Friedrich himself was transferred from the clinic to his mother's home in Naumburg, where Franziska cared for him with the same devotion she had shown throughout his childhood. The sight of her brilliant son reduced to a state of childlike dependence was heartbreaking, but she never wavered in her commitment to his care. She would read to him from his favourite books, play music that sometimes seemed to reach whatever remained of his consciousness, and maintain the dignity of his daily routine, even as his mental faculties continued to deteriorate. The contrast between Friedrich's public reputation and his private reality during these years was stark. His books, which had been largely ignored during his productive period, were beginning to find audiences across Europe. Young intellectuals discovered in his work a prophetic voice that spoke to their own sense of cultural crisis and spiritual homelessness. Artists and writers found inspiration in his aesthetic philosophy and his vision of creative self-transformation. Political radicals of various stripes attempted to claim his authority for their movements, but the man himself was beyond any awareness of this growing influence. Visitors to the Naumburg household reported a figure who bore little resemblance to the fierce intellectual warrior of the books. Friedrich had gained weight and lost much of his hair. His famous moustache had grown wild and unkempt. He would sometimes recognize old friends, but more often he seemed to exist in a private world accessible to no one else. His daily routine was simple and repetitive. He would rise late, dress with his mother's assistance, eat meals that were prepared according to his simple tastes, and spend hours at the piano, playing fragments of melodies that seemed to come from some deep repository of musical memory. He showed no interest in current events, no awareness of the growing controversy surrounding his work, no recognition that he had become one of the most discussed thinkers of his generation. The philosophical community was divided about how to interpret Friedrich's condition in relation to his work. Some argued that his madness invalidated his ideas, that the breakdown was the inevitable result of thinking that had pushed beyond the bounds of human reason. Others contended that his mental illness was entirely separate from his philosophical achievement, that the insights he had reached during his productive years remained valid regardless of his subsequent fate. More troubling was the question of whether his final works, produced in the months before his collapse, could be trusted as authentic expressions of his philosophy. The grandiose tone of Ecce Homo and the bitter extremism of the Antichrist suggested a mind already affected by disease. Yet these books also contained passages of extraordinary insight and literary power that seemed to represent the culmination of his intellectual development. When Franziska died in 1897, Elizabeth took complete control of both Friedrich's care and his estate. She moved him to Weimar, the cultural capital of Germany, where she established the Nietzsche Archive as a centre for the study and promotion of his work. But her version of that work bore little resemblance to what Friedrich had actually written and believed. Elisabeth Nietzsche was a German nationalist who had prophesied the rise of a master race that would dominate Europe and establish a new world order. She emphasized passages that could be interpreted as supporting imperialism and militarism, while suppressing his criticisms of German culture and politics. She forged documents, altered texts, and manufactured conversations that supported her political agenda. The real tragedy was not just the distortion of Friedrich's ideas, but the fact that he was present, but unable to respond to what was being done in his name. Visitors to the archive would sometimes be allowed to meet the philosopher himself, now a figure of almost mythical status in European intellectual circles. They expected to encounter a Promethean figure who had stolen fire from the gods. Instead, they found a gentle, confused old man who showed more interest in the cakes served at tea than in the discussions of his revolutionary philosophy taking place around him. Friedrich's physical health remained surprisingly robust despite his mental condition. The disease that had destroyed his mind seemed to have stabilized, leaving him in a state of perpetual mental childhood, but without the physical deterioration that might have ended his suffering quickly. He could walk, though he needed supervision. He could feed himself simple foods. He could speak, though his words rarely formed coherent sentences. The routine at Weimar became as predictable as it had been in Naumburg. Friedrich would rise, dress with assistants, take walks in the garden of the archive building, and spend hours in the music room where a piano had been installed for his use. Elizabeth would parade him before visitors when it served her purposes, presenting him as the living symbol of German intellectual greatness, while carefully controlling what those visitors could observe and report. The 20th century arrived while Friedrich remained suspended in his twilight existence, unaware that his name was being invoked in debates about everything from women's rights to colonial policy. His concept of the Superman was being twisted into justifications for racial supremacy. His critique of Christian morality was being used to support nihilistic philosophies he would have despised. His celebration of strength and power was being interpreted as advocacy for military aggression and political domination. Meanwhile, more careful readers were beginning to discover the actual content of his work, finding in it insights about psychology, morality, and culture that had little in common with the crude interpretations being promoted by his sister and her political allies. They found a thinker who had been remarkably prescient about the cultural crises that would define the new century, who had anticipated the psychological and spiritual problems that would emerge as traditional religious and moral authorities lost their credibility. These readers recognized that Friedrich's madness, tragic as it was, did not diminish the value of the work he had produced during his years of sanity. If anything, the contrast between his intellectual achievement and his personal fate made his philosophy more poignant and powerful. Here was a man who had pushed human thought to its limits and paid the ultimate price for his intellectual courage. The irony of his situation would have appealed to the healthy Friedrich's sense of tragic comedy. The philosopher who had proclaimed that one must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star was now pure chaos without the possibility of creation. The thinker who had celebrated the will to power was now entirely powerless. The advocate of self-overcoming was trapped in a self that could no longer be overcome. Yet even in his diminished state, Friedrich occasionally displayed flashes of the personality that had made him one of the most compelling figures of his generation. Visitors reported moments when his eyes would suddenly focus, when he would make observations that seemed to cut through the confusion surrounding him. A musical phrase might trigger a memory of his earlier life, bringing a brief smile to his face before he returned to his private reverie. His physical appearance during these final years became iconic in a way that his actual philosophy never quite achieved. Photographs from the period show a figure that seemed to embody the romantic image of the mad genius, with wild hair, intense eyes, and an expression that suggested both profound wisdom and terrible suffering. These images would shape popular perceptions of philosophers for generations, creating a visual representation of the intellectual who had sacrificed everything for truth. Elizabeth carefully cultivated this image, understanding its propaganda value even as she distorted the ideas it was supposed to represent. She commissioned sculptures and paintings that presented Friedrich as a heroic figure, a German Prometheus who had brought fire to humanity. The real man, confused and dependent, was hidden behind this mythologized version that served her political and financial interests. The Nietzsche archive became a pilgrimage site for intellectuals from across Europe and beyond. They came seeking wisdom from the prophet of the New Age, hoping to understand the man who had seen furthest into the future of human culture. What they found instead was a carefully managed presentation that revealed more about early 20th century German nationalism than about Friedrich's actual philosophy. But the power of his written work could not be entirely contained by Elizabeth's manipulations. The books themselves, even in distorted editions, continue to speak to readers who are grappling with the same questions that had driven Friedrich to his insights and ultimately to his breakdown. They found in his work a voice that had anticipated their own struggles with meaning and value in a world where traditional certainties had collapsed. As the new century progressed and Europe moved toward the catastrophic conflicts that would validate many of Friedrich's darkest predictions about modern civilization, his reputation continued to grow. Artists, writers, politicians, and ordinary readers found in his work concepts and phrases that seemed to capture their own experiences of cultural crisis and personal transformation. The man himself remained oblivious to this influence, living in a present that had no connection to past achievements or future consequences. His days passed in a routine of simple pleasures and basic needs, attended by caregivers who understood that they were responsible for one of the most significant intellectual figures of the modern era, even as that figure had been reduced to a state of permanent helplessness. On August 25th, 1900, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche died quietly in Weimar at the age of 55. The immediate cause was stroke, but the underlying condition was the syphilitic infection that had been destroying his brain for over a decade. His death marked the end of one of the most extraordinary and tragic careers in the history of philosophy, a life that had encompassed both unprecedented intellectual achievement and profound personal suffering. Intellectual achievement and profound personal suffering. The funeral arrangements revealed the final irony of Friedrich's existence. Elizabeth orchestrated an elaborate ceremony that transformed the quiet death of a broken man into a nationalist spectacle. She invited prominent German intellectuals, politicians, and military officers to pay their respects to what she presented as a great German thinker. The service was held not in the simple Lutheran tradition that had shaped Friedrich's childhood, but as a kind of secular ritual celebrating Germanic cultural superiority. The mourners who gathered in Weimar represented the very forces Friedrich had spent his productive years criticizing. German nationalists who had appropriated his concept of the Superman for their racial theories. Anti-Semites who ignored his explicit rejections of their ideology. Militarists who had twisted his celebration of strength into justifications for aggressive warfare. The irony would have been devastating to the healthy Friedrich, but the man in the coffin was beyond caring about such misrepresentations. Elizabeth's eulogy carefully omitted any mention of Friedrich's attacks on German culture, his admiration for Jewish intellectuals, or his cosmopolitan vision of European civilization. Instead, she presented him as a prophet of German greatness, who had foreseen the coming dominance of the fatherland. The cemetery service concluded with the burial of a man whose actual ideas were as dead to the proceedings as his physical body. Yet even as Elizabeth was cementing her false version of Friedrich's legacy, other forces were at work that would eventually restore a more accurate understanding of his achievement. Careful scholars were beginning to examine his manuscripts and letters, revealing the systematic distortions that had shaped public perception of his work. They discovered a thinker far more complex and sophisticated than either his admirers or detractors had realized. The early 20th century would prove that Friedrich's diagnosis of European cultural crisis had been remarkably prescient. The First World War erupted just 14 years after his death, fulfilling his predictions about the violent consequences of nationalism and the collapse of traditional moral authorities. The soldiers who marched to their deaths in the trenches of France and Belgium were products of the very cultural forces Friedrich had identified as symptoms of civilizational decline. The war's aftermath brought the nihilistic despair that Friedrich had both feared and anticipated. Traditional institutions lost their credibility as millions of young men died for causes that proved meaningless. Religious faith crumbled under the weight of mechanized slaughter. Political systems collapsed as societies struggled to make sense of unprecedented destruction. The cultural crisis Friedrich had diagnosed in the 1880s became the lived reality of the 1920s. But the war also accelerated the spread of Friedrich's ideas beyond Germany. Soldiers carried his books in their packs, finding in his celebration of courage and his acceptance of tragedy some comfort in the face of senseless violence. Intellectuals across Europe discovered in his work a framework for understanding the collapse of the old order and the emergence of new forms of human possibility. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought to power a movement that explicitly rejected traditional moral and religious values, though the Bolsheviks' materialist ideology was far removed from Friedrich's aristocratic individualism. Nevertheless, the revolutionary transformation of Russian society seemed to validate his prediction that the old world was dying and that new forms of human organization would emerge from its ruins. In the artistic realm, Friedrich's influence became unmistakable as modernist movements embraced his critique of traditional aesthetic categories. Painters abandoned representational art in favor of abstract expressions that seemed to embody his call for the revaluation of all values. Composers broke free from harmonic conventions that had governed Western music for centuries. Writers experimented with new forms that rejected linear narrative in favor of psychological exploration and stylistic innovation. The emergence of psychoanalysis as a new form of understanding human behavior owed much to Friedrich's insights about the unconscious motivations underlying moral and rational thought. Freud acknowledged his debt to the philosopher who had anticipated many of the discoveries that would make psychology a scientific discipline. The concept of the unconscious, the analysis of repression, the understanding of human behavior as driven by forces beyond conscious control, all of these had been prefigured in Friedrich's psychological investigations. Yet the political appropriation of Friedrich's ideas was becoming increasingly dangerous. The rise of fascist movements across Europe brought new distortions of his philosophy that were far more systematic and destructive than anything Elizabeth had achieved. The Nazis would claim his authority for their racial ideology, his concept of the Superman for their Aryan supremacy, his critique of democracy for their totalitarian state. These political movements understood intuitively what Elizabeth had grasped from the beginning, that Friedrich's ideas possessed enormous emotional and intellectual power that could be harnessed for purposes he would have despised. The very qualities that made his work philosophically valuable, its psychological penetration and its challenge to conventional thinking, also made it susceptible to manipulation by those who sought intellectual legitimacy for their political projects. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that careful readers of Friedrich's work could find in it powerful arguments against the very movements that claimed his authority. His cosmopolitanism contradicted nationalism. His individualism opposed collectivist ideologies. His celebration of cultural diversity undermined racial theories. His critique of mass movements applied as much to fascist rallies as to democratic assemblies. But the nuanced understanding required to appreciate these complexities was not available to the mass audiences that political movements needed to reach. They required simple slogans and dramatic symbols rather than sophisticated philosophical arguments. Friedrich's concept of the Superman was easily reduced to racial superiority. His will to power became crude domination. His revaluation of values justified the destruction of legal and moral constraints on political action. The Second World War represented the culmination of the cultural forces Friedrich had identified as threats to European civilization. The mechanized slaughter, the systematic genocide, the collapse of international order, all of these seem to validate his warnings about the consequences of cultural nihilism combined with technological power. Yet the war was fought partly in the name of ideas that had been falsely attributed to him. The post-war period brought a more careful examination of Friedrich's actual philosophy as scholars gained access to manuscripts that Elizabeth had suppressed or distorted. They discovered a thinker whose complexity had been systematically reduced to serve political and ideological purposes. The real Friedrich emerged as someone far more humane and sophisticated than either his supporters or critics had realized. This scholarly rehabilitation was aided by the emergence of existentialism as a dominant philosophical movement. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus found in Friedrich's work a predecessor who had grappled with the same questions about human freedom and responsibility in a world without predetermined meaning. His emphasis on self-creation and authentic existence spoke directly to intellectuals who were trying to rebuild European culture after the catastrophe of total war. The feminist movement of the 1960s brought new attention to Friedrich's writings about women, which proved to be far more complex and progressive than his reputation suggested. While he had certainly made statements that reflected the gender prejudices of his time, he had also been one of the first male philosophers to take seriously the question of women's intellectual and creative capacities. His friendships with intellectual women like Lou Andrea Salome revealed someone far more open to gender equality than his public reputation suggested. The counterculture of the 1960s found in Friedrich a prophet of liberation from conventional moral and social constraints. His call for the revaluation of all values resonated with young people who were rejecting the authority of traditional institutions. His celebration of individual creativity and authentic existence provided intellectual justification for the cultural revolution that was transforming Western society. But perhaps the most significant development in Friedrich's posthumous influence was the recognition that many of his insights about human psychology and social organization had been validated by developments in science and social theory. His understanding of the unconscious anticipated discoveries in neuroscience. His analysis of power relationships prefigured developments in sociology and political science. His critique of objective truth prepared the way for postmodern philosophy and cultural studies. The late 20th century saw Friedrich's ideas penetrating popular culture in ways that would have astonished his contemporaries. His phrases entered common usage, often divorced from their original philosophical context, but retaining something of their provocative power. The concept of the Superman influenced everything from comic books to self-help literature. His call to become who you are became a therapeutic slogan. His declaration of God's death became a cultural commonplace. And so we reach the end of our journey through the complete life of Friedrich Nietzsche, a man whose very existence embodied the contradictions and complexities of the modern human condition. From that frigid morning in 1844, when a pastor's son entered the world, to his quiet death in 1900 as a broken but paradoxically immortal thinker, we have witnessed one of the most extraordinary intellectual odysseys in human history. This was not just the story of a philosopher, but the story of a cultural prophet who saw further into the future than perhaps any mind before or since. Nietzsche diagnosed the spiritual crisis of Western civilization with surgical precision, predicted the catastrophic conflicts that would define the 20th century, and provided intellectual tools that continue to shape how we understand ourselves and our world. The tragedy and triumph of his legacy lie in this fundamental paradox. The man who proclaimed the death of God and the coming of the Superman was ultimately destroyed by his own human frailty, Yet his ideas proved more durable than bronze, more influential than empires. Today, more than a century after his death, we are still grappling with the questions he posed about truth, morality, power, and human possibility. Nietzsche's life reminds us that the pursuit of ultimate truth comes with ultimate risks, that thinking at the limits of human possibility can exact the highest possible price. But it also demonstrates that ideas, once unleashed into the world, take on a life of their own, continuing to challenge, inspire, and transform long after their creator has passed into silence.